Good afternoon. This is Internet talk show Window to the Future from Whitehall, Globus Global, and my name is Kamil Akhmetov. In our show, we meet interesting people from IT world, and together with them we look back, analyze the present, and we're trying to look into the future. In the 1990s, everybody thought that the World Wide Web exists due to its data capacity, and even Bill Gates called Internet as an information superhighway, comparing it with future capacity and particularly with the speed. Today, everybody knows that the real capacity of Internet as an information superhighway is data storage infrastructure and data processing. Analysts of TMT Consulting, they estimated Russian data center market volume as 23.6 billion rubles in 2017, which makes for 10.6% annual comparative growth. Forecast for 2018 shows further growth by 9% in rack mounts and volumes and by 13% in revenue. The Ministry of Communications proposed to create a data centers consortium. It will coordinate data centers development and also create widespread network of data centers that will make their services available all across Russia. Issues and prospects of data centers market. We are going to discuss this with a unique expert in data centers market who over 20 years been a top manager in leading companies, and yet he prefers to work in young, quickly growing markets such as Hungary, Greece, South Africa, and of course Russia. He is also managing a Russian company IXcellerate. This is Guy Willner. Hello.
Здравствуйте.
Guy, how do you consider this definition that cloud computing doesn't exist? There is no cloud. There are just many, some private computers all over the place.
Yeah, the cloud is a misleading term because the computers that need to store all this data are very physical and they're on the ground, they're not up in the sky. They're in some very big data centers around the planet.
Nevertheless, you started working in this business, in data centers business. You started doing it in 1990s when they were not called like that. They were called just servers. And back then, big companies, especially corporations, they stored all data within the company. And also the applications also were within their internal resources. And only visionaries, the most bravest ones, they were thinking about storing their data with external providers. So what actually indicated back then that everything will change? So what is your experience in beginning of this work and this market? Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, we saw two things. One was that it was becoming more expensive to keep the computers in an office, in a company. And another thing, which was very important, was the growing of ecosystems. And so if you had computers in your company, you couldn't connect them easily to your suppliers and your customers. It was much better to put your computers in the same place as your suppliers and customers so that you could connect them all together, as that's what we saw was the future of the internet. It was this commercial ecosystem.
How did it happen? I mean, in terms of raising the trust in technology, did they actually start trusting the technology right away, or did they know that it will be beneficial to keep it in the cloud, to keep it somewhere else rather than in the company?
Well, the first thing that happened in the late 90s was telecoms deregulation. So you had dozens of telecoms operators, each with their equipment, and they needed to put it somewhere. And telecoms must interconnect with somebody. Otherwise, there's no message going through. So these telecoms providers were the first users of data center. They were the first companies to outsource, to move their equipment out of their offices into a common marketplace.
Yet nevertheless, from the broader market, from the broader audience, the trust to the concept of keeping the data somewhere with someone, with a stranger, first it was quite suspicious, don't you think?
Yeah, sure. And companies became used to that because they had to, because they had to share their data. So if you were a Goldman Sachs or a Sberbank and you were trying to do some exchange foreign currency or share sales, you had to have somebody to exchange with. So that data had to be shared with other banks or with stock markets or with trading platforms. And so it was natural that they had to bring that trust into a neutral marketplace, which was the data center.
That's quite an interesting analogy when you're talking about data center. When people, we compare it with the banks, and people give their money to the banks, and there is also the issue of trust. Don't you think there is a psychological barrier that at some point it was overcome from the corporate side?
Yeah, yes, there was a barrier, but the things that broke the barrier down were, number one, the need for the banks to access the marketplace. The bank couldn't work in a closed environment. It had to be in the marketplace. So they had to trust some marketplace, number one. Number two, that especially since the financial crisis, sort of 2008, 2009, the banks don't have hundreds of millions of dollars to spend on building their own super duper data centers. They have to outsource. It's much more flexible. If you're delivering flowers across Moscow, you could design and build your own delivery vans, and I'm sure it would be very cool to do that, but it would cost enormous amounts of money and take enormous numbers of years to get those delivery trucks designed and built. It's much better if you go and buy a delivery truck from a garage. In the same way, the banks learnt that if they managed their own data center, they probably didn't manage them as well as a professional did. And they were sure that it would cost them twice the price if they did it internally instead of using a professional.
Since we're talking about the price, then immediately I have a question. So, how proper the prices are for small business and corporations when they pay for the cloud services? Many people think that the prices are inflated, and not everybody is sure that working with the cloud software that's economical. They don't see the difference if they're using cloud solutions rather than having their own servers. So say like economy on this, is it really beneficial using cloud storage rather than using their internal resources?
Well, it's a tricky question because there is no clear answer. Cloud can be good for some people and it might be expensive for others. If you're a small company and you want to develop fast, using cloud on the public internet is quite a good thing to do. It helps you scale up. If we look at some reports, I think Spotify last year said that they'd saved $36 million annually by moving out of the cloud onto their own hardware in a data center. So there's a question of scale. If you're very big and you have many specific applications, maybe you can't really use the cloud. Moscow Stock Exchange has about 500 or 600 applications, for example. Most major banks in Russia have about 500 or 600 applications running their systems. So it's difficult to find 500 or 600 clouds that can actually manage all this. So the reality is, for a bigger company, it's a mixture of physical hardware and software in a data center, and then connecting to the cloud operator, who, of course, is also in the data center.
Okay, then how can we describe the client, the customer, that cloud computing, the cloud services would be beneficial in terms of the scale or industry? You said telecom is the first, then banking. What other businesses could benefit from this?
Because cloud is fairly early stage at the moment, the businesses that benefit most from cloud are businesses with a very simple model. So it could be somebody like Zvuk, providing music online to its users. That's a very clear thing. Or maybe a video streaming company doing horse racing videos. So if it's very specific products, very specific services, then it's easy to use a standard cloud service to provide that computing power. If you are into more complicated industries where there might be some regulation, where you have accounting systems, regulatory systems, it gets more complicated to use cloud, because cloud is kind of it's a volume game.
Probably you remember that probably the first users of cloud solutions were individual users, web post, transmitting files, and people were using this and they knew it works. And today, small business, what do you think? Maybe it's also one of the typical users of clouds, because for small business it's quite typical to have an office solution that you pay, say, like $50 or $100 a year, and that's it.
Yeah, I mean, for those types of services, it's fantastic, because for a small business, today they don't have to buy some computers, buy some software, make sure it's updated, connect it all up. A small business can do all of its accounting and finance on the cloud. It can store all its documents on the cloud. There are some amazing collaboration, teamwork products on the cloud as well. So everything can be done from the cloud. So that you don't really need a physical office either. You can work from a cafe or from home, and you've got your whole office on the cloud. It's enormously useful for small businesses, that's clear.
But say, on other way around, talking about the big companies, corporations, state-owned organizations, public agencies. So how this cloud reality impacts them, and say global companies or big corporations or government authorities, why would they put in the data center in Russia? That's the question. Would it be beneficial for them?
Well, for a start, we have the data sovereignty laws in Russia, which means that personal information has to be physically in Russia. So any state organization has to have physical infrastructure in Russia for that data. So if they are using cloud, they need a Russian cloud solution, or a Russian hosted cloud solution. A lot of this is driven through centralized agencies who are writing new software for government applications. So it's quite centrally driven. And I've seen this in many countries where the move of the government to the cloud is quite centrally coordinated, because it's a very complex thing to do.
European recommendations that probably will be enforced in a week. As far as I understand, they want to unite all the resources within Europe. So they have a bit different policy, uniting all the resources within European Union.
Yeah, that's. But Europe is an interesting idea, because within the European Union, some countries are more equal than others. So, for example, the German state will not host any thing outside Germany. So they cannot share their data across Europe. I believe it's Latvia or Lithuania has declared a diplomatic zone in a Luxembourg data center, so that part of the data center is actually Latvian territory, and they back up their citizens' data in Luxembourg as a backup for the country. So yeah, there is some European harmonization, but that's an enormous project. If you look at how administration works in each European country, it is like looking at an apple and then an orange and a banana and a pineapple. They are completely and totally different, totally different. So Europe will go through maybe 20 years of harmonization to get there. For Russia, it's easier. It's one country. So a lot of this between the regions can be standardized.
But do you understand it properly that any solutions of local government, that the data should be stored within the country, it's also quite beneficial for data centers of this country, because there is an incentive to build data centers in the country.
Yeah, I mean, we always hear these comments about the 1% of the richest people have 50% of the world's wealth. What we hear less about is that there are something like 8 cities in the world which have 50% of the world's data centers. And there are no Russian cities in that list. There is more data center capacity in Luxembourg than there is in the whole Russian Federation. So if you look at the data center market, which is storing data for the population, there should be a direct link between a person and how many data centers there are in a country. So this will follow through. If you are in Krasnoyarsk or you're in Novosibirsk or in Ekaterinburg and you want to look at a video or you want to catch up on the news, it's much better if that content is near you. There are 19 cities in Russia with more than 1 million population. So for me, there are 19 cities where we need data centers, and we need carrier-neutral, multi-network, multi-vendor data centers to create these marketplace ecosystems to deliver all this content. So yeah, it's the Russian data center market is going to go in the next 5 years.
So in these 19 cities in Russia, when we have those data centers, it's not going to happen within 5 years, right? So it's going to take longer, right?
Well, the development will start within the next 5 years. We will see data centers opening up across Russia over the next 5 years. It takes time to build data centers. Building a data center is like building a small airport. It's a very expensive, it's a very expensive thing to build, a data center. So it does take time to raise the finance and to get the designs and permissions. But yeah, over the next 5 years, we'll see a big change in Russia.
By the way, you were probably saying that data center is like an airport for internet. Probably you said that, right? So what do you mean by that?
So what I mean is that if you're sitting in a cafe in Moscow and you want to look at the news station in Sri Lanka, because you're going there next week and you want to check what the situation is in the south of Sri Lanka and whether there are any new events happening. That information has to go into the data center somewhere near you in Moscow. But that is going to go on an international telecoms network, on somebody's undersea cable or a fiber or satellite. Once it gets to the Moscow data center, it has to get to you. But you might be on Beeline or MTS or Rostelecom or Mastertel or some local provider in Moscow. So when that content from Sri Lanka lands in the Moscow data center, it has to go out in all sorts of different directions so that the end user can actually access it. So it's a little bit like if you were landing from Sri Lanka and now you want to fly to Kazan. you want your connection in the data center. If you have an airport, you have choice of different airlines. So your content can land in Moscow and it can go off to different places in Russia. But those different places are served by different airlines. It's not all one airline. It's multiple airlines. It's Aeroflot, it's S7, it's Air France or whatever. So the data center as an airport is a place where the content arrives and then gets distributed through the country.
What is it? Eight cities, the biggest cities where the data centers are located. What are those cities?
Those the cities where the most concentration is are mostly in the US. So you've got 4, I think, cities in the US. Then you have Singapore, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, and Tokyo. Those are kind of the biggest concentrations currently. Singapore serves a massive zone in Southeast Asia, where countries maybe 2,000 kilometers away from Singapore are receiving their content from Singapore.
Who primarily invests in data centers? Is it private investment, is it state investment, or corporation investment? Who are those investors?
Well, the most successful investors are the institutional investors who have invested in data center for some of them for 20 years. And the state investments in data centers are generally unsuccessful because states are good at running government, they're not very good at running business.
I have heard a lot from Microsoft that they're a big investor in data centers, that they have a lot of data centers all around the world. Are these the companies?
No, if you look at the whole internet landscape, there are maybe 5 companies that really need to build their own data centers because they're so big, it's quite sensible for them to build their own. But apart from those 5 companies, there are another 3 million companies around the world that cannot build their own data center, and there's absolutely no point in building their own data center. If you are DHL and you're transporting goods around the world with a fleet of, say, 500 jets, planes, it might be a good idea to have your own airport somewhere around the world with big warehouses connected to it. But if you're posting a letter, you're unlikely to want to buy your own helicopter to have the letter delivered. You'll probably get the postal service to do that for you. So there are only 5 big internet companies that need that enormous capacity of data centers. And those companies generally build their own, but they also use a lot of data center capacity around the world.
And what are those 5 biggest companies?
It's the usual, for the moment, it's the usual suspects, if you like. It's Amazon, Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, Google. It's that group at the moment. But that group is being joined by some Chinese players who are also playing on a global scale.
It's quite interesting that you mentioned LinkedIn, because out of these companies, LinkedIn doesn't work in Russia. And I think that they didn't manage to bring personal data of Russians into Russia. So what do you think, what it has to do with?
LinkedIn, you're getting close to the social media problem, which is that if Russia does anything about any social media, immediately everybody says, that's bad, stop it. The history of the internet is the internet grew up mostly in the US. And so most of the data from users around the world is in the US still. That is now changing because many countries are saying, I want some data here, but I also want some computers here. I also want some jobs here. So I don't want all of my internet in my country being delivered from offshore. So the issue with LinkedIn is a bit complex, and that is going through with the Microsoft acquisition of LinkedIn. Microsoft is probably looking at a solution for that now.
For example, situation in China, is it transparent for you? Is it clear how it works? Who actually owns data centers?
Yeah, in China is a different planet. China Mobile, the mobile provider in China, has 860 million subscribers. So if China Mobile wants to do a little bit of testing on a new product before they sell it internationally, they can test it on 860 million users. So they have an enormous industrial base. So if you build a data center in China, it's immediately enormous. So the scale of anything in China is 10 times what we see in a normal country. I classify Russia as a normal country. It's a normal economy. It's got the biggest internet user population in Europe, in Russia, but it's not the size of China. So China is out there on its own. The Chinese government decided to build a very resilient internet inside China. So you kind of have two different internets. So if you go into China from Hong Kong, there's a lot of applications that stop working as soon as you get to China.
So we're talking about China and Eastern countries. As I understand, as you said, Russia is like a great Silk Road. I read your interview, and it's the main hub between Europe and Asia. And we are in Russia, we understand Europe in Asia, and then or Europe understands Asia. We here understand them better. So what do you think? How the future for Russia looks, the development of the business, your business specifically and business in general, and high technologies in Russia, say within next 5 years, or maybe longer?
Well, Russia is interesting for China and Southeast Asia, and it's interesting for Western Europe and the US because Russia is a very big market. So both sides, if you like, are looking at what to do in Russia. And so half of the development of the internet in Russia will come from inside Russia along the Silk Route, but half of the development in Russia will also come from outside Russia, people bringing in new products and services. You know, Alibaba is the biggest e-commerce platform in Russia today. So there's technologies coming in, and there's technologies being developed, and it just happens that the string of cities across Russia is kind of along the Silk Route.
So you're a technological visionary. So in your view, say if we look into 5 years of development or more, how the high technologies will look and how our life would change in terms of technology, how the technology will influence that. So it's kind of a visionary question.
Well, then let's look at today. If you have a self-driving car, it will generate about 2 petabytes of data every year. If you look at storage devices today, the hard drive, the mechanical storage device today, which is the cheapest storage you can buy, in a unit about this big, you can get 80 terabytes, not much more than that. So with today's technology, if I wanted to store 1 year's data for a self-driving car, I probably need about 5 racks of equipment in a data center. So imagine if there were 3 million self-driving cars. It's crazy the amount of data that you have to store. You'll have to store the data because the insurance company will need to know the 360-degree camera videos. You need to store it for 1 year, just in case there's an insurance claim or whatever. So this information is going to be stored in enormous volumes. That's just self-driving cars. So that's one area of technological advance that's going to happen. In Russia, a lot of banks, government departments and businesses will go through enormous technological advancement. There's been a lack of investment in Russia, obviously because of all the geopolitics at the moment. As soon as that money starts being invested in Russia, there'll be a massive technological revolution in Russia. And Russia is very well equipped for that because it's a very educated population.
It turns out that the things that we're talking about not so much, they need a lot more data storage than other things that we talk about. And for all personal data, storing all personal data, we need only 20 racks, 20 rack mounts, right?
Well, if you consider personal data as just passport number, telephone, and whatever, then yeah, you can fit it in a small little SD card. It's very little. But what is personal data? This is the question. And how far does it go? Is personal data a high-definition photo of you? Is it a video of you driving along? Is it an interview? What is it? But yes, the physical personal data is quite a small element. The difficulty for many internet companies is to separate that essentially text information from the rest of the information. And that is quite complicated.
Yes, right. The definition of personal data may be broader, and obviously there will be more stored on different mediums, including our personal life data, and people are very much concerned about this. Do you think this concern is valid in terms of the future, that everything will be recorded?
Yeah, of course the concern is valid, and we're seeing with Facebook being interviewed currently about what data is stored, finally people are waking up to the fact that everything is recorded. It is a big issue, and we will see questions about this in the coming years. If I can get some artificial intelligence to copy your voice patterns, then I can impersonate you on the phone and maybe get access to your bank accounts. So we need a lot more sophistication in how we can track whether our personal information is being abused or not. The user agreements that we sign on the internet but never read are very complicated. Maybe in the future we will have our own personal legal bot which will negotiate with the other guy and it will say, fine, Facebook says you can have this, this and this. I've negotiated with them. If you want this, this and this, you're going to have to pay $2 a month. If you allow them standard access, it's free. And so you'll have legal bots negotiating with each other on these crazy terms and conditions which nobody reads. So this will come in maybe 5 years.
And this is quite interesting. What else will change in our life in terms of this? You know, how do you see our life in this world in, say, 10, 15 years when they have like 10 times more data? So how are we going to live in this environment?
Well, we'll still have breakfast and lunch and dinner, that's for sure. I'm sure there'll be many changes. Many of them are exciting. If I look at what my children do, they are using a lot of internet value to create things, to edit photographs, to write blogs, to design new logos, new products. So there's an awful lot of very, very useful things coming out of the internet now, which means that somebody in an apartment in Perm can potentially design a complete video game end to end just using applications that are on the internet today. Or they can design a car or a bicycle quite easily using software that is on the internet. So there's an enormous opportunity with the internet to be very creative for people, which is something new.
How do you see this prospect for the countries that level of lifestyle is much lower than in Russia, say Africa? So when those things actually reach this country?
Africa's always suffered through having not enough investment. Usual investment in Africa has always been government money. So it's kind of, here's some money and quieten down, don't complain. Whereas actually what Africa needs is people giving money for entrepreneurs. There's a lot of microcredit, but for an entrepreneur in Africa to start a business, they might need $50,000, $100,000. And there aren't that many investors who will invest in those businesses. But it is a very creative economy. If you look at Kenya, Nairobi is called the London of Africa now, because it's very creative, quite multicultural, and developing very fast technologically. Kenya was the first country in the world to use mobile phones to make bank payments 10 years ago. So some of the technology that is being developed on the internet today in some countries in Africa might appear first because it's easier to implement when there is nothing.
Don't you think that now we don't quite understand what life will be? We just hope that Y generation and Z generation that will come to business, they will figure it out better what to do with all of it than we do.
Sure. I mean, when we discovered electricity, we had no idea what it would do. There are many things that we really don't understand. The fact is, if I bring it back to data centers, the fact is the data centers become the beating heart of the country. If the data centers fail in a country, then there's nothing you can do. We can't film this interview. I can't get a Yandex taxi back to the next conference. I can't do anything. The planes stop flying. Everything stops if the beating heart stops. And the beating heart today is the data center. So it's really important that there are many, many data centers. We are one data center company, but we have a number of competitors in Moscow who are also very good. And we hope that they develop like we develop. And we're very happy that there are multiple players in the market, because you need that protection in any country of having multiple data centers, because it's this beating heart. It's so important now.
So it's a great metaphor. That data center is a beating heart. That's probably the metaphor that explains why we're here today and why we are talking about it today, because we understand for communication, for internet, it's not only capacity that matters. We understand that data is very important, and resources, hardware and software to process data. This is all important, and this is what will be the bridge of our technological world today.
And I would add that the importance is that to understand that there are two elements to the data centers in a country. Number one is it's the beating heart, it's where all the computers go. The secondly is it's the marketplace. And it's really important to understand that, because the reason why people come to data centers is not just because it's a nice building and the electricity is good. It's also because they will meet other companies that they either supply or that they buy from. So if you have a little farm and you produce carrots, you could have a little table by the road and you could try and sell your carrots. And maybe every 10 minutes a car drives past and maybe you might sell some carrots, but you're not sure. If you take those carrots and you drive to the marketplace on the Monday morning and you set up your table in the marketplace, you're guaranteed to sell your carrots, because everybody goes to the marketplace to buy food and vegetables. You might not get the best price, but you're guaranteed to sell them. So if on Friday evening you still haven't sold them, fine. You chop the price in half and they're gone. You go home, you have some money, and you've sold your carrots. That's like the data center. If you've got some interesting content, but you're not connected to Beeline or MTS or Rostelecom or whatever, then nobody will ever know that you've got that nice content, and nobody will pay you for that content. So you have to bring that content into the beating heart so it can actually be distributed through the country. So the ecosystems are very important. That could be e-commerce, because if you buy a chair on the internet, immediately the e-commerce company has to connect with a shipping company, a warehouse company, maybe the manufacturer of the chair, the tax authorities. Everything is connected, and immediately that transaction is going through multiple different companies. Now, if all those computers are in the same place, it's a much more reliable transaction, and it's a faster and it's a cheaper transaction. And so the whole ecosystem thing is really important.
For me, this discussion was very interesting. Thank you very much for coming for this conversation. I hope that was very interesting for you as well. So thank you very much.